Hello, this is Sebchoof here. I wanted to start a series called RotMG Repair, where I would take on issues that many players have with the game and explain why I would have a good idea on how to fix it and how I would fix it if I was the developers. I'm hoping that in doing so, they'd have a much easier time analyzing the issue and having a good idea on how to fix it. This is also a good opportunity for developers of similar games on making the best experience for their players. Now, on the first episode of RotMG Repair, I wanted to take on the brand new released Shatters rework. With the Shatters, I actually really enjoyed it, especially in testing. I think my suggestions for fixing the problems that the community have for the dungeon hold merit because I have soloed this dungeon 2 times so far on crappy characters, and I've done at least 10 completes in prod and have done a few others in testing, as well as having way too much experience in the game outside of this dungeon. Now, with the good points, many players and myself would say that the visuals are great. Like, for example, the sprites of the bosses and the enemies are amazing. Also, the visual effects of the phases that the bosses have and the enemies look really amazing as well. And the overall map and layout of the boss rooms and the whole map is really awesome as well. In my opinion, this is probably the best looking dungeon that Deca has released so far, actually. And it holds a really interesting feel, where many other dungeons aren't able to do the same thing. On top of this, the sprites of the items are really good looking as well. As well as this, the overall design of the enemies and the boss phases are great. Every single minion has like its own special attacks, and before each boss, the minions are completely separate to each other. So Deca went through massive lengths to make sure that there's unique minions before each boss, making fighting them a lot more interesting than compared to other dungeons. Also, a lot of the boss phases are really different to each other and have a great design because it's really unique to the boss and holds a great challenge. A lot of the other bosses in the game have a lot of issues that these bosses avoid. Like, for example, I have this issue with Oryx Free and Baza, where the arena is way too big and it allows players basically to leech and be really safe just by avoiding the boss. I believe the bosses in the Shatters do a really good job at keeping the danger constant throughout the arena, so there's no like a leechable area, if that makes sense. And yeah, the phases are ridiculously fun. Deca tried really hard, you can tell, to make this more of a bullet hell and avoid cheap insta-kills. There is a bit of an issue with insta-kills in there that I will mention when I go through the bad parts, but overall, I really like how the phases are individually designed. And also, the designs of the items are super unique as well. It's great that items in this game no longer only follow like just differences in stats and maybe a slight difference in the range and trajectory of the bullets, but instead have a lot more interesting components to them. Like, for example, all of the weapons that are released in this dungeon have a mechanic where if you get hit, you lose on offensive stats, but if you don't get hit, then they work out to be stronger on average than the other items. I also really like that they made it possible that you can apply skill to make the clear to first boss faster. Like, for example, if you have rushes, it can save on clearing speed a lot. And it's great that Deca did this because it's hard to keep the game interesting for people looking for danger and benefiting them as well. It's something that I really hope to see in other Realm-like games, like Beneath the Nexus and Dark's Dominion, for example. Exactly how this is done is there's switches around. You have to destroy many of the switches to create them into teleporters and open up this bridge where you can go to the first boss. You can do this by clearing every single enemy or the whole map and destroying all of the switches. But if you're in a small group and there's one rusher, you can significantly make the first boss get activated sooner. However, this is something that the second clear is missing, and I'll get into that in more detail in a moment. Also, the last positive aspect that I'd say that the dungeon has is the difficulty is spot on. This is as hard as the dungeon should have been, and it's not like difficulty that's too forced. With experience, this dungeon will become a lot easier, just like other dungeons have become. Like, for example, people clear O3s. Some people clear O3s ridiculously easy now. There is a common criticism of this dungeon that many people say that it's merely unfriendly, which in my opinion is just a skill issue. No offense. I think with experience, the openings that melees have to attack the boss will become more clear. But at the moment, you should be happy that you're experiencing a challenge in the game, because with PvE games, since there's only a set number of things that the bosses can do, the challenge will quickly disappear the more you play and the more you learn the dungeon. And yeah, I gotta say, in testing, I really enjoyed this dungeon, but there's underlying systems in this game that make the boss fights and clearing feel a lot slower than they should be, and makes the dungeon just a lot more unmotivating overall. And there are small other things that I'll mention. A lot of people say that the boss fights in this dungeon are really long, due to HP or something like that. But in reality, I think the reason why the boss fights are so slow and arduous is because there's repeating phases and rapidly switching phases. For example, on the second boss it spawns birds. Don't know why they decide to do this, but for some reason the birds keep spawning. So you'd kill them like, I don't know how many times they actually die. It feels like 5 if I had to guess. But yeah, they just non-stop die, and it can be kind of frustrating because they also do the same phases after they respawn as well. It's really unsatisfying and kind of jokes with the time that you spend. I think for the second boss, what I would do if I was the developers, I would make it that, because in the second boss, I'm not sure how many times the birds spawn, but there's 3 generators you have to kill. There's a phase where you have to kill 1 bird, at least one phase where you have to kill 1 bird, and at least one phase where you have to kill 2 birds. I think what Deca should do is, there's also a phase where you have to get the boss down to spawn the first bird. I think what Deca should do is they should make it that you have to bring the main boss to a set amount of HP, then kill a generator, then it spawns the first bird, and then when you get the first bird to 0 HP, it spawns the second generator. And then when you get the generator to 0 HP, it spawns 2 birds, and then it spawns the third generator. And then there's like an annoying phase where the red bird just swings around really fast and the blue bird stays in the middle. You can honestly, if I was the devs, I'd probably get rid of that one. This would significantly reduce the amount of time the boss takes to kill, while also maintaining the difficulty of the boss fight. Because, yeah, I don't know, it just feels like the birds just keep constantly coming alive. It's annoying enough that the birds have like a seemingly random movement sometimes, and you have to like chase them, but sometimes it's made really difficult because of either ice portals or fire bombs. And I think players would really appreciate if that was to happen. Similarly, with the third boss, the Forgotten King, I actually really enjoy the dark phase because the phases are much longer than the light phase, and it's much easier to get damage on him. Not because in the dark phases he's chasing, which definitely helps in most of the phases, but because in the light phase, for some reason, in a lot of his phases, he's either not aggressive at all and he just spawns on like somewhere in the map where you end up having to meet up with him. But another annoying thing about the light phase is that he changes so rapidly between the phases. So like I think there's also a damage cap as well as a time cap. So for example, he would like spawn somewhere. He's got many different attacks that he can do, which is awesome. But he would spawn somewhere, and then when you finally reach him by evading his attacks after he teleports, he would teleport again and begin another phase. It's really frustrating and boring because I could not count the amount of times he teleports. It's probably like between... of course, it depends on how much damage you're dealing, probably, even though there is what seems like damage caps before he teleports again. But it seems like it's between 15 to 30 times, which is really tedious. Like with the dark parts, that one, at least it feels like it doesn't change as many times. And if it does change as many times, it's much more enjoyable to fight him in that phase, because the phases in the dark stage are less time restricted. So you'd be able to get more damage on before he swaps to another phase. What I would do with the issue of the light phase changing way too frequently is I would make it that the boss stays in its phases for at least 3 times the time. That would allow players to be able to reach the boss and deal a bit of damage before it moves again. I would also set the damage requirement to 3 times what it currently is, because yeah, it does have a very low damage amount from what I've experienced before it moves again. Another extremely frustrating thing about the light phase is there's these orange crystals roaming around, and they can insta-kill you. It does give you a warning by flashing white, but I don't know whose idea it was to make the crystals a light orange. It's extremely hard to see when they're actually flashing. And yeah, it hasn't happened to myself, but I've seen many people die from insta-dying from full health to this enemy, which would be the most frustrating thing ever. If I was the developers, I would change the crystal color to something that would be much easier to see flashing, like a dark blue, for example. They might as well made the crystal white and flash white with the current color that it has, and how hard it is to see. Also, there's many issues with the clear from first boss to second boss. I love the concepts that are there, like for example, having to push the flames along the towers. It's really cool how many different kinds of rooms there can be. Like for example, there's a puzzle room, there's the prison room, and the library room, just to make some examples. But there are a few reasons why clearing these rooms are extremely boring and frustrating. Firstly, the existence of the purple enemies are extremely frustrating for a number of reasons. The fact that they can attack the towers and have the flame reset to the beginning feels really disrespectful of our time, because it isn't, as you can imagine, it's not entertaining at all, and if you've experienced this yourself, there's nothing more annoying in this dungeon. And yeah, you just have to guarantee that all of the purple minions are down and have the flame go through the whole way. I've actually in my previous upload about the Shatters, where I did the dungeon solo, I cut out like 30 minutes of me clearing second with 1 or 2 others before it turned to in solo, where the flame just kept resetting because one purple minion would keep attacking from behind. And yeah, it was not a fun experience. I wouldn't wish it on my enemies. Also, having the enemies respawn is a questionable decision. I mean, I think it's an alright thing to have, but that paired with the horrible HP scaling in the game is at times really annoying as well. It's not too much of a problem when you're at like the 10-person, 20-person player amount, but I was doing a run with 50 really experienced players with the game, and we were clearing the dungeon probably as fast as it could be cleared, and it was horrifically slow. And while we were clearing, the purple enemies would like spawn in the middle of the group. I was actually on the best character suited to live from an enemy without being armored or invincible. I had about 1400 HP, where I looked at chat for one moment and I walked over one of the purple minions as it respawned, and it insta-killed me. So definitely a bit of a skill issue there, but at the same time, I feel like with how tedious the second clear is with the current HP scaling in the game, it isn't that fun, even if I lived to have to clear the purple minions again and the other enemies at the same time. I do think that the HP scaling should get reverted to what it used to be but I would make it a linear equation that increases more than it used to with each player. Like, for example, it used to be 10%, but it should be more like 20% instead of what we have now. I am going to make a dedicated RotMG Realm of the Mad God repair video on just HP scaling, because there's a lot to go over. But to cut it short, the HP scaling in the game currently is extremely incentivizing groups of like 15 people, because at the 25 player amount, the amount of HP per person starts rising a ridiculous amount. And I can't help but to assume that this was done just to sell more keys, because it goes against the MMO aspect of the game. But to make the second clear and to make the second clearing and the clearing in other dungeons much more enjoyable and interactive for all group sizes, the HP scaling should have an overhaul. And even if Deca did change the HP scaling to sell more keys, I think it's in their best interest to make the product a lot more enjoyable so that more people play, than try to reduce the amount of people going into each one to sell more keys, if that makes sense. What I would do with the purple minions, it might be, like, at the very least, what I would do is not let them be able to attack the towers. And maybe on top of that, remove them entirely if they're not going to change the HP scaling. Because having them constantly respawn and having them spawn on the groups is just not a fun experience. The great thing about making the purple minions not be able to attack the towers as well is it allows an possible application of skill to make the dungeon more enjoyable for those seeking more danger and trying to make it faster. Like, for example, what I went over with the first clearing to first boss, how you can rush it potentially. You would be able to rush it if the purple minions didn't exist. Like, for example, I showed in my my video just before how it's kind of able to be rushed. I was only able to do that because I didn't get unlucky with too many purple minions spawning. Also, during the first clearing, for some reason there's invisible enemies, which are really hard to see, and a lot of people have actually died from standing on them. I haven't experienced this myself, luckily, but it does not look fun. I would just remove them, to be honest. Also, the other enemies overall in the first area, it feels like they're quite shallow in their design. All of the enemies stand at a distant range, shooting at your current location, with no variation. This makes it kind of easy to rush, because all you have to do when you get to a tower is slightly shift where you are, because the enemies will always shoot at your current location, so that when you do strafe slightly, they'll always miss. I think it would be cool if Deca fixes the minions by having some that are a bit more aggressive, like the Abyss Brutes, while also having enemies that maybe shoot at your location in the future, so it has player tracking, because that would make it a lot more enjoyable experience for if you do decide to clear. I do want to go over some criticisms that I have heard in the community about the dungeon, which I don't entirely agree with. I just want to go over the melee unfriendly issue a bit more. I do think it's mostly due to a lack of experience. In my solo of the dungeon, I had the worst setup basically, and was not prepared at all, but I was still able to finish. This is partly due to the reason that if there is a phase that is melee unfriendly, the phases are timed, so they change to another phase anyway. It just requires you to survive the phase and wait for one that you're more comfortable with. I do believe that you can hit all phases with a 3.5 range weapon, except for a very, very few, like 1 out of 5, which you can just wait out. And yeah, a lot of people say that the bosses have way too much HP. In my opinion, the HP that the bosses and enemies have are fair, besides the HP scaling. That's horrible. It's just in the small runs that I've done, it feels like the HP is the correct amount, but because of the rapid phase switching, There is an invincibility phase they have in between that, and the adjustments of the enemies, like for example the birds and the third boss, that make it a lot more tedious and make it take a lot more time. If they were to do the adjustments that I suggested, like for example with the second phases and the third phases, with the same HP, I think people wouldn't have an issue with the duration of the boss fights. Also, some people were saying that the white bags are too rare. To be honest, I think this isn't true. I've only gotten 1 gemstone so far, and yeah, I've definitely been unlucky because I've done at least 10 completes. But think about it like this. Item rarity should be thought about like this. Imagine like a scale where one side is item satisfaction and one side is item rarity. If you make an item extremely rare, when you do get the item, it will be so satisfying to get. But if you make the item too common, just like with some other dungeons where the items have become way too common through means such as like chest events and the forge, people won't care that it drops and people won't want to do the dungeon. Right now there's a massive rush of people doing the dungeon, even though they're not enjoying it, just because of the dopamine hit from the items. That's how powerful item rarity can actually drive players to play the game. That people go through the insane clearing and boss fights just to get those item motivation spikes. I'm kind of hesitant to do it myself because there's probably going to be blueprints of it in the future, but I would definitely do at least a few more runs of it in its current form, because I really enjoy the boss fights, even though that there's those rapid phase switches and things like that. I do also think that there should be a loot overhaul in terms of like how often loot drops for big groups and small groups, but that's going to be dedicated to another episode of RotMG Repair. So, TLDR, what I think Deca should do is they should fix the second boss so that birds don't spawn too often. I think that Deca should fix the third boss by only the light phase, where the boss should not change so rapidly. They should extend the amount of time and HP that the boss can take before it changes phases again by 3 times, in my opinion. They should fix those orange gems so it's a lot more clear when they do shoot or are about to shoot. They should stop purple minions from being able to shoot the towers, and potentially even stopping them from respawning altogether if they refuse to change the HP scaling in the game. And that is so the second clearing isn't so boring, and that there's the potential for risky gameplay where the benefit is that the dungeon is a lot faster by being able to rush, without the purple minions being able to reset the towers all the time. And Deca should make some of the minions in the first clearing of the dungeon to the first boss more interesting by changing the attack patterns, like making some lead shots instead of all of them just shooting at the current location. And they should get rid of the invisible enemies or rework them. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I do want to make a lot more of these videos in the future so that I can get my ideas across, because I do have some more interesting ideas in the future that not only Deca can consider, but also other developers of games similar to Realm. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'm really interested in what you guys have to say, so comment below on what you think. If you guys enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, all that jazz. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.